On the morning of February 22nd, 1901, a steamship called the City of Rio de Janeiro was approaching San Francisco harbor after a long voyage from Hong Kong. It was 3 days late. The captain was eager to get home. The thick fog rolled in at dawn. Within minutes, the ship would sink, and 128 people would die. But here's what matters for this story. The Lighthouse Board knew this could happen. They had known for years. And what they said in the official report after the disaster proves it. The City of Rio de Janeiro was a passenger steamship built in 1878. She was 220 feet long, powered by steam engines, and sailed regularly between San Francisco and Hong Kong. On February 19th, she departed Hong Kong with approximately 210 passengers and crew. Most of the passengers were Chinese and Japanese emigrants, people trying to find work, trying to build lives on the West Coast. They were heading home from a long sea voyage. The journey should have taken about 18 days, but the Rio de Janeiro encountered rough seas, storms. They fell 3 days behind schedule. By the time the ship approached the Golden Gate on the morning of February 22nd, the captain was under pressure. The passengers wanted to dock. The company wanted the ship unloaded. 3 days late meant lost money. At 5 a.m., a San Francisco bar pilot named Fred Jordan came aboard. His job was to guide the ship through the Golden Gate, the narrow entrance to San Francisco Bay. It was tricky navigation. Even experienced pilots found it dangerous. The fog that morning was thick, very thick. You couldn't see more than a few hundred feet ahead. But the order was given to proceed. Captain Ward felt the pressure. The pilot felt the pressure. The passengers below deck were sleeping, unaware of what was about to happen. Pilot Jordan began guiding the ship through the narrow channel. It was about 5:30 a.m. when he saw something in the fog. Rocks. Actually, he didn't see them, but the ship hit them. Hard. The impact tore open the hull. Water rushed in. The ship was built before watertight bulkheads were standard, so the water spread throughout the vessel. The city of Rio de Janeiro sank in less than 10 minutes. There was confusion on the ship. The officers spoke English. The crew and many passengers spoke Chinese or Japanese. When the order was given to abandon ship, many didn't understand. The lifeboats couldn't be launched quickly. People were trapped below decks. The water was cold. The fog was so thick you couldn't see the shore, even though it was only a few hundred feet away. The life-saving station at Fort Point was less than half a mile away. The crew there had no idea what was happening. The fog was too thick. The visibility was zero. By the time anyone realized a ship was sinking, most of the passengers were already dead. Of the approximately 210 people on board, 128 died. Some sources say 135. The exact number was never completely clear because the passenger list included Chinese emigrants whose names weren't carefully recorded. Captain William Ward, who had commanded the ship for years, went down with the vessel. The 82 survivors clung to wreckage in the freezing water. An Italian fisherman happened to be nearby and pulled people from the water. Without him, there would have been almost no survivors. For years afterward, bodies washed up on the shore at Fort Point. This was the worst maritime disaster in San Francisco's history. The newspapers called it San Francisco's Titanic. And here's the part that matters for this investigation. The Lighthouse Board knew this could happen. They had documented the problem, and they did nothing. The city of Rio de Janeiro sank near Fort Point Lighthouse. Fort Point had a fog signal, a large bell that was supposed to sound a warning when fog rolled in. It was the system's job to alert ships that they were entering dangerous waters. But the bell at Fort Point was weak. It didn't carry far. It certainly didn't carry out to where Mile Rock was, the submerged rocks where the Rio de Janeiro actually hit. This wasn't a secret. This wasn't unknown. The Lighthouse Board had been receiving complaints about the inadequate fog signal at Fort Point for years. Ship captains reported that they couldn't hear the fog signal. Harbour pilots said it was too weak to be useful. The signal could only be heard over a very limited area, and often not at all until a ship was already abreast of the fort. In other words, by the time you could hear the warning, you were already in danger. Multiple ships had run aground in the area because of inadequate warnings. The Lighthouse Board had documented this. It was in their records. But they didn't fix it. Why? The reason was bureaucratic and financial. The Lighthouse Board was responsible for all lighthouses on the entire West Coast. There were never enough resources. There were never enough inspectors. There was never enough money for upgrades. So when the fog signal at Fort Point needed to be replaced with a better one, it was put on a list. It was filed. It was noted as needed. But it wasn't prioritized. It wasn't funded. It wasn't done. The ships kept coming. The fog kept rolling in. The bell kept failing to warn them. And on February 22nd, 1901, the city of Rio de Janeiro sank. The Lighthouse Board's official response came 3 weeks later in their annual report for 1901. They wrote this: "The bell can be heard only over a very limited area, frequently not at all until abreast of the fort. An efficient signal should be heard considerably to seaward to give warning of the approach to the vicinity of Fort Point Shoal. The recent disaster to the steamer Rio de Janeiro on this reef, involving a loss of over 100 lives, might not have occurred if an efficient signal had been in operation here." Read that again. They said the disaster might not have occurred if they had fixed the fog signal. They admitted in their official report that they knew the signal was inadequate. They admitted that fixing it would have probably prevented the disaster, and they admitted they hadn't fixed it. They knew. They documented the problem. They did nothing. 128 people died. This story is about 1901, but it's not really about 1901. It's about an institution that knew a problem existed, that documented the problem, that understood the consequences of the problem, and that did nothing. The Lighthouse Board wasn't corrupt. They weren't deliberately trying to kill people. They were managing a system with limited resources. They were prioritizing based on available funding. That's a bureaucratic problem, not a criminal one. But the result was the same. 128 people died while the Lighthouse Board managed their budget. Here's what I want you to think about. Right now, today, there are probably lighthouse inspectors somewhere looking at fog signals that aren't powerful enough. They're probably looking at navigation equipment that's outdated. They're probably documenting problems that they know haven't been fixed. There are certainly other industries where inspectors are discovering safety problems, where people understand the risks, where the solutions are known, and where the problems aren't being fixed because of budget or bureaucracy, or because fixing them isn't a priority until something goes wrong. Until 128 people die. Until a ship sinks. Until a disaster forces action. This story is about 1901. But it's not really about 1901. It's about an institution that knew a problem existed, that documented the problem, that understood the consequences of the problem, and that did nothing. The Lighthouse Board wasn't corrupt. They weren't deliberately trying to kill people. They were managing a system with limited resources. They were prioritizing based on available funding. That's a bureaucratic problem, not a criminal one. But the result was the same. 128 people died while the Lighthouse Board managed their budget. Here's what I want you to think about. Right now, today, there are probably lighthouse inspectors somewhere looking at fog signals that aren't powerful enough. They're probably looking at navigation equipment that's outdated. They're probably documenting problems that they know haven't been fixed. There are certainly other industries where inspectors are discovering safety problems, where people understand the risks, where the solutions are known, and where the problems aren't being fixed because of budget or bureaucracy, or because fixing them isn't a priority until something goes wrong. Until 128 people die, until a ship sinks, until a disaster forces action. The Lighthouse Board's own 1901 report is the primary source for this story. It admits the fog signal was inadequate. It admits this inadequacy might have caused the disaster. The National Archives has the Lighthouse Service records, the inspection reports from Fort Point, the maintenance logs, the documentation of the repeated complaints about the weak fog signal. The wreck of the city of Rio de Janeiro was documented by maritime historians. The death toll of 128 is recorded. The names of some passengers are known. Captain William Ward is documented. The Mile Rock lighthouse that was built after the disaster still exists. It was built because of this incident. Congress's appropriation in 1902 is documented. This isn't speculation. This isn't conspiracy. This is institutional failure documented in government records. The Lighthouse Board knew. They did nothing. People died. And because a disaster happened, they finally fixed the problem. That's the pattern. Identify risk, document risk, do nothing about risk, until disaster forces action. Then the resources suddenly appear. The priorities suddenly change. But the 128 people on the city of Rio de Janeiro don't come back. On February 22, 1901, at approximately 5:45 a.m., the city of Rio de Janeiro struck Mile Rock in heavy fog at the entrance to San Francisco Bay. Within 10 minutes, the ship had sunk. Within 3 years, the Lighthouse Board had built a new lighthouse and installed a more powerful fog signal. 128 people dead. That's what it took. The ship lies at 287 feet deep. Occasionally, divers visit the wreck. There's treasure hunting that happens, though there was never actually any gold aboard. There are documentary films about the disaster. But for most people, it's just another shipwreck story from the gold rush era. Except it's not. It's a story about what happens when an institution documents a safety problem and does nothing. The fog signal didn't work. They knew this. They did nothing. 128 people died. Then the resources appeared. Then the priorities changed. Then the problem was finally fixed. If the Lighthouse Board had approved the new fog signal in 1895, before the Rio de Janeiro sank, 128 people would have lived. Captain Ward would have received his warning. The ship would have been guided safely into port. But that's not what happened. Because sometimes institutions don't fix problems until they have to, until a disaster forces their hand, until 128 people are dead, and the newspapers are calling it San Francisco's Titanic, and Congress is asking questions. That's when action happens, and by then it's far too late. The lighthouse still stands on Mile Rock. The fog signal at Fort Point still operates. The records of the Rio de Janeiro are in the archives, and the question remains, how many times does this pattern repeat before an institution takes action, before 128 lives? Or before 200? Or 500? How many people have to die before the resources become available? That's the real question from this story. And it's one you're probably avoiding, because the answer suggests something you don't want to believe about how institutions actually work. They don't prevent disasters. They respond to them. And by the time they respond, it's too late for everyone on the city of Rio de Janeiro.